Hello again, class. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the study on the politically incorrect Jesus. We're going to move to a new study. Before we start, I want to tell you how we got here. I had prepared a 12-lesson study on hell and was feeling pretty good about myself, that I was ahead, and and it's a very fascinating subject because we don't talk about hell much. We pretty much ignore the God of the Old Testament, and there are a lot of really profound things that we're going to find out about hell. But as I was finishing up that preparation, I kept in the back of my mind, in my prayer time, I'm hearing, Larry, you need to talk about the pandemic. You need to talk about God's role in that pandemic. I'm saying, well, you got to give me some direction, Lord. Where would I start? How would I do that? Well, I have Kindle Unlimited. I'm sure some of you do too. And as you know, they track everything you read. And as that was nagging at me in the back of my mind, up comes a suggestion. It said, a book you might want to read. The name of the book was God's Sovereignty in Our Suffering. So I bought the book. Most of what I read on Kindle I read free, but this one I was willing to pay for. And it answers the questions that I was having about how to deal with the pandemic, how to understand it, and how to understand God's role in it. So, the book is a compendium from talks that were given in 2005. There was a Desiring God National Conference, which I'd never heard of, but that conference was on suffering and the sovereignty of God. And the people who gave the talks there agreed to convert their talks into written chapters so that they could get the message out to more people. And all of them have addressed in one way or another how God's sovereignty relates to human suffering. They've done so by answering questions such as, in what ways is God sovereign over Satan's work? How can we be free and responsible if God ordains our choices? What is the ultimate reason that suffering exists? How does suffering help to advance the mission of the church? How does God's grace enter into our sufferings? Why is it good for us to meditate upon the depth and pain of severe suffering? What is the role of hope when things look utterly hopeless? There are some deep and difficult truths embedded in the book, but it's not an academic book. The authors are not writing as theoreticians and waxing eloquent over abstract themes. This is a book of applied theology. It's theology that's been forged in the furnace of affliction. Two of the contributors are paralyzed and deal with chronic pain. Two have experienced death of a parent when they were young. Two had children who died in the past few years. Two at the time the book was written, were battling cancer. The point of mentioning this is not to portray these folks as victims or elicit sympathy, but for us to understand that they are fellow soldiers in the battle, fellow pilgrims in the journey. We need to think of them as friends who are taking the time to write to us about what God has taught them concerning His mysterious sovereignty in the midst of pain and suffering. The first lesson is entitled Suffering and Sovereignty of God, 10 Aspects of God's Sovereignty over Suffering. This part of the study is written by a man named John Piper. John's 75 years old now. He's a theologian, a pastor, a chancellor of Bethlehem College and Seminary in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He taught biblical studies at Bethel University for 6 years before he became pastor for preaching and vision of Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis. For 33 years he's been a pastor. He's a founder and a senior teacher of desiringgod.org, which is named for a book he's written called Desiring God, Meditations of a Christian Hedonist, or Hedonist. He's written a number of award-winning books. The Evangelical Christian Publishers Association has given him awards for a book called Spectacular Sins, one called What Jesus Demands from the World, one called Pierced by the Word, one called God's Passion for His Glory, and he's had a bestseller, Don't Waste Your Life, and another bestseller, The Passion of Jesus Christ. I only give you that so that we know who's talking to us, and that he is very qualified to talk to us on this subject or any other subject as far as that goes. But anyway, the impetus for putting this book together was the reality that God, as the supreme value in and above the universe, God is. He's absolute, eternal, and infinite. Everything else and everybody else is dependent and finite and contingent. God Himself is the great supreme value. Everything else that has any value has it by connection to God. God is supreme in all things. He has all authority, all power, all wisdom, and He is all good to those who wait for Him, to the souls who seek Him. That's Lamentations 3:25. His name as Creator and Redeemer and Ruler of all is Jesus Christ. As you all know, in the last, I guess, 20 plus years, we've had tsunamis and 9/11 and Katrina and 10,000 personal losses have helped us discover how little the American church is rooted in this truth. David Wells, who has written a book called Above All Earthly Powers, Christ in a Postmodern World, says it like this. This moment of tragedy and evil, which he's referring to 9/11, but we can also relate to the COVID-19 pandemic. This moment of tragedy and evil shone its own light on the church, and what we came to see was not a happy sight. For what has become conspicuous by its scarcity, and not least in the evangelical corner of it, is a spiritual gravitas, one which could match the depth of these horrendous evils and address issues of such seriousness. Evangelicalism, now much absorbed with the arts and tricks of marketing, is simply not very serious anymore. In other words, our vision of God in relation to evil and suffering was shown to be frivolous. The church has not been spending its energy to go deep with the unfathomable God of the Bible. Against the overwhelming weight and seriousness of the Bible, much of the church is choosing at this very moment to become more light and shallow and entertainment oriented, and therefore successful in its irrelevances to massive suffering and evil. The popular God of fun church is simply too small and too affable to hold a hurricane in his hand. The biblical categories of God's sovereignty lie like landmines in the pages of the Bible, waiting for someone to seriously open the book. They don't kill, but they do explode trivial notions of the Almighty. So, this article that we're going to look at today, or this talk, John hopes or prays that God's going to stand forth and reassert his creator rights in our lives and show us his crucified and risen Son, who has all authority in heaven and on earth, and awaken in us the strongest faith in the supremacy of Christ and the deepest comforts in suffering and the sweetest fellowship with Jesus that we have ever known. Bold objectives. The folks who've contributed to the whole book have suffered, and some more visibly than others. We don't need to know all those details. Suffice it to say that none of them is dealing with a theoretical issue in the book. They live in the world of pain and loss where we live. These are people who love those who are dying, people who live with chronic pain, people who have just lost one of the most precious persons in their life. None of us in this pandemic has not been touched by losing relatives or friends or having dealt with COVID themselves. People who are about to enter a time of suffering in their life for which they are totally unprepared. We were not prepared for COVID. I'm not sure that we could ever be prepared for the massive deaths that it has caused. But John's approach, he's going to take in the first chapter, is not to solve any kind of problem directly, but to celebrate the sovereignty of God over Satan and God's sovereignty over all the evils that Satan has in hand. John's conviction is that letting God speak his word will awaken worship, like Job's. And worship will shape our hearts to understand whatever measure of God's mystery he wills for us to know. So, what we're going to look at now is the celebration of 10 aspects of God's sovereignty over suffering and Satan's hand in it. And what John means in this section is that when he says God is sovereign, is not merely that God has the power and right to govern things, but that he does govern all things for his own wise and holy purposes. We're going to look at the first three aspects of God today, and then we'll cover the next 7 in the second lesson. But the first aspect of God is that God is sovereign over Satan's delegated world rule. Satan is sometimes called in the Bible the ruler of the world. That's mentioned several times in the book of John. Or God of this world, 2 Corinthians 4:4. Or the prince of the power of the air, Ephesians 2:2. Or a cosmic power over this present darkness, Ephesians 6:12. This means that we should probably take him seriously. Let's read about that in Luke 4:5-7.
The devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours.
When Satan promises Jesus that he will give him sovereignty over land and so forth, it's strictly true. If Jesus had bowed in worshipful submission to him, he might have had land, but Satan's claim that he can give authority and glory to the world kingdoms to whomever he wills is a half-truth. No doubt he does play havoc in the world by maneuvering a Stalin or a Hitler or an Idi Amin or a Bloody Mary or a Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-un. The list goes on and on. But he does this only at God's permission and within God's appropriate limits. And this is made clear over and over again in the Bible. Let's look at Daniel 2:20 and 21 and Daniel 4:17.
Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people.
When the kings are in their God-appointed place, with or without Satan's agency, they are in the sway of God's sovereign will. Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. Evil nations rise and set themselves against the Almighty. This is addressed in Psalms 2:2-4.
The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them.
Do they think their sin and rebellion against God can thwart the counsel of the Lord? Psalm 33:10 and 11 answers that question.
The Lord foils the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of the peoples. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations.
God is sovereign over the nations and all their rulers and all the satanic power behind them. They do not move without his permission, and they do not move outside his sovereign plan. The second aspect of God is that God is sovereign over Satan's angels, demons, and evil spirits. Okay? Satan has thousands of cohorts in the supernatural evil. They're called demons. or evil spirits or unclean spirits or the devil and his angels. We get a tiny glimpse into demonic warfare in Daniel 10 when the angel who is sent in response to Daniel's prayer says, "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me." We remember that from our study in Daniel. That's in the 10th chapter of Daniel in the 13th verse. So, apparently the demon or the evil spirit over Persia fought against the angel that God had sent to Daniel, and a greater angel, Michael, came to his aid. But the Bible leaves us with no doubt as to who is in charge in all these skirmishes. Here's how Martin Luther put it. "And though the world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him, his rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word will fail him." We see glimpses of those little words at work. For example, when Jesus comes up against thousands of demons in Matthew 8:29-32. Melanie's going to read that for us now.
"What do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs." He said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water.
In this passage, there were thousands of demons possessing a man, and they were making him insane. They cry out, what have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time? Well, see, even demons know that there's a time set for their final destruction. And Jesus spoke to them one little word: go. And they came out of the man. So there's no question who is sovereign in this battle. People had seen this before and were amazed and said, "He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Mark 1:27. They obey him. As for Satan, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure. But as for Christ, even though they slay him, they always must obey him. God is sovereign over Satan's angels. Aspect number 3. God is sovereign over Satan's hand in persecution. Peter describes the suffering of Christians like this. 1 Peter 5:8-9.
"Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings."
So the sufferings of persecution are like the jaws of a satanic lion trying to consume and destroy the faith of believers in Christ. But do these Christians suffer in Satan's jaws of persecution apart from the sovereign will of God? When Satan crushes Christians in the jaws of their own private Calvary, does God not govern those jaws for the good of his precious child? Listen to Peter's answer to that in 1 Peter 3:17.
"For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil."
if God wills that we suffer for doing good, we will suffer. And if He does not will that we suffer for doing good, we will not. The lion does not have the last say. God does. The night Jesus was arrested, satanic power was in full force. Let's look at Luke 22:3 and 31.
Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat.
And Jesus spoke into that situation one of His most sovereign words. Here's what He said to those who came to arrest Him in the dark. Luke 22:52 and 53.
Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour, when darkness reigns.
The jaws of the lion close on me tonight, no sooner or no later than my Father planned. No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. That's Jesus speaking. John 10:18. Boast not yourself over the hand that made you, Satan. You have 1 hour. What you do, do quickly. God is sovereign over Satan's hand in persecution. Let me encourage you, even if it's not your habit to take notes or what, let me encourage you to get a pen and notebook or tablet or whatever and make some notes on these profound things that we're going to study about God's sovereignty. I hope that we're going to gain a strong appreciation for who our Father really is and how powerful He really is. We're not going to rush through this study because some of the things that we're going to talk about, like these aspects of God, we need to just think about. We need to observe what's going on in our life, what's going on in our families' lives, what's going on in our neighborhood, what's going on in our world, and realize that all of this is part of God's plan, no matter how little we understand about it, no matter how limited our mental acuity is, how little we understand about what's going on. So we're going to hopefully keep these lessons short enough that you can have time to ponder what we're talking about, to meditate on what we're studying, to pray, and ask God to allow ourselves to worship Him in a deeper way because of the understanding that we're gaining through this study. Look forward to seeing you next lesson, and we'll pick back up here and look at the 7 other aspects of God. Have a great week.